So originally we had somebody who works out at China Point and studies seabirds was supposed to come give a lecture before that field trip, and she was going to tell you all about how wonderful it was. We had to reschedule, so now it's up to me. So I'm gonna try and fly through this and then talk up this field trip that's happening. Check your syllabus. It's happening on Sunday the 28th of this month, so 2 weeks, so in a couple of weekends. It's not obligatory. You can come if you want to, and we're gonna carpool, but it's awesome. Right now, there's lots of albatross chicks. You'll see lots of baby birds and mommy birds, and they're huge birds. You'll see lots of really interesting plants. We almost always see monk seals. We see a lot of humpback whales. You can see dolphins swimming off the point. It's a really, really special place if you haven't been there before. If you have been there before, it's equally special. So please try and make it. Okay. Island evolution. I'm going to start not with a slide that says island evolution, but instead with a slide of this gentleman, Alfred Russel Wallace, who wrote a book called Island Life. And he doesn't look like the type that would really enjoy island life, but it turns out that he was. And this was, islands were critically important to him in his formation of the theory of evolution. As you guys probably all have heard this story a million times now, both of these guys had this idea of evolution at more or less the same time. Charles Darwin is the more famous of the two because he was an aristocrat. He was already a well-respected scientist, and he had this idea rimming in his head for 30 years before he ever put pen to paper. And what really spurred him on to write his book was a letter by Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with more or less the same idea. Interestingly, both of these gentlemen were working on islands when they came up with this idea of evolution. Darwin was working, which island group is Darwin famous for?
Galapagos.
The Galapagos. Does anybody know where Wallace spent a lot of his time studying evolution? What was that?
Hawaii.
Yeah, Hawaii. He spent a lot of time in Hawaii, and he spent a lot of time sort of in Malaysia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, that part of the world. So he was a professional collector, so he really got around and did a lot of collection. But anyway, for both of these guys, it was islands that really spurred their imagination and helped them come up with this idea of evolution.
I think they have the same beard style.
They do have the same beard style. It's one that I'm working on. Right, so this is a picture of the South Pacific Islands. Many of these Wallace visited during his time collecting for other people. And I'm just going to give you a few quotes from this book. And one of them was that oceanic island biotas differ from continental island biotas. This was his observation, right? Oceanic islands are islands that were never part of the continent. These are things that pop up because of volcanoes. So they start fresh, sterile, if you were, and then they recruit all of their biota over time, much like Hawaii, right? And he noticed that things on islands were different. They were unique, they were special, they were disharmonic. That there was something weird about islands that didn't fit with this idea that God created everything in 7 days, which is sort of how people believe it was happening. Yes?
Can you just please explain again what disharmonic means?
What disharmonic means? Who can explain what disharmonic means? Go ahead.
When there's lack of representation from continental species to island species at the closest continent, I guess?
Yeah, so it's when an island, with the biota of an island, you can talk about flowers, you can talk about plants, insects, when that composition differs from the nearest mainland source. So that's all it means is that it's different on islands. If you want a very short definition, it would be disharmony. The island biotas are different from mainland. This is an illustration from Wallace's book, Island Life. And yeah, he did spend a lot of time in Hawaii. And he spent some time in Honolulu. in some other places as well. And there's nothing I want to show you about this map other than this was important to Wallace. He noticed that Hawaii was also no exception to this rule that island biotas were different. And he did some collecting here as well.
So it's a Renai.
What's that?
Does it also say Renai?
Yeah, Renai. Renai. He had a RL issue. So, okay, so evolution. What is evolution? Biological evolution. Who can give me a definition of biological evolution? You guys are a bunch of bio majors. Nobody knows what evolution is?
I'm not fine.
Go ahead, take a stab at it.
I was stretching, but
Like the retention of genetic mutations if it perpetuates an organism's fitness.
Okay, good. So something about retention of mutations in organisms, more or less. That's right. I think the simplest definition, without getting into natural selection or sexual selection, any of that, the simplest definition of biological evolution is this. It's just a change in allele frequency over time. It doesn't mean that you have to see it with your eyes. It doesn't mean that it has to have any impact on fitness. These are all things that people have noticed to explain this process and why it works in nature. But that's not the definition of evolution. Evolution, very simply, is just a change in allele frequency over time. And it could be due to mutations or other factors that lead to this change in allele frequency. So that's not what's interesting about island evolution, though. This is just evolution everywhere. How this manifests in islands is sort of peculiar. And if you go to oceanic islands in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic, there's certain trends that you see in these biotas, in both plants and animals, time and time again. And these are three main trends that you can see. One is island gigantism, another is loss of defenses, and another thing is pollinator shifts. And this has happened in Hawaii repeatedly as well as other places. So let's talk about what these three things are. Island gigantism is pretty self-explanatory, and these are things that Wallace observed as well. And he gave this great example of the Hawaiian violet. So this is a mainland violet, an African violet. Maybe your grandma collected these and put them in her windowsill near her kitchen sink. They're small little things, and they have sort of showy flowers. They're nice, they're pleasant, they're okay. In Hawaii, our Hawaiian violets are these really tall, sort of woody shrubs. They get to be about that tall. They're impressive plants. And their ancestor would probably look something like this. It got to Hawaii. It found a lot of open niches to fill, and so it evolved into a gigantic shrub. And this is something that Wallace observed. He said, well, violets form tall, shrubby plants. A lot of examples of this. Geraniums, the same thing. He says, shrubby geraniums grow 12 or 15 feet high, right? Mainland geraniums, again, this is something, these tend to be annual plants that people plant in their gardens, their tea gardens. And a geranium got to Hawaii, and it formed this enormous shrub, tree shrub. And this is something that you see again and again. This is Bidens, one of our dandelion species. So it looks like a dandelion. If you go to California, this is what it looks like. It's a little dandelion. In Hawaii, this is radiated. Actually, this is a bad example. This didn't evolve from this. But a close relative evolved into something, again, that became a very woody tree. So this is something that we see also with animals. And you can see this in the Channel Islands off the coast of California, too. Rodents that get over there tend to get much bigger. They don't have competition from other animals. There's nothing grazing these plants. There's no reason for them to maintain a small stature. They get big. Okay, another thing that Wallace observed and that we see on other islands is this idea of a loss of defense. So plants come from places where there's a lot of different plants, a lot of herbivores. Maybe there's grazing deer. Maybe there's humans that want to collect these plants to eat them. And they make things like prickles and spines to deter people from chewing on them. Some plants produce poisons, toxins, alkaloids, things like that. Some smell real bad. They have a number of interesting defenses that they develop over the years to deter herbivores and to increase their own fitness. These defenses, however, don't come without a cost. As you can imagine, you have to use a lot of carbon to produce these prickles. When you ought to be allocating those resources to photosynthesis and producing seeds and things. So if you can get away with not producing these prickles or these chemical defenses, then you can increase your fitness and perhaps have more offspring. And that, it turns out, is what a lot of our Hawaiian plants have done. They arrived in Hawaii. We don't have any ungulates here. There's no deer. There's no cows. There's nothing that was chewing on plants. And they quickly learned that if they give up their defenses and allocate those resources to photosynthesis and reproduction, that they can improve their fitness. And this is what's happened with our Hawaiian raspberry, which is prickleless, which is pretty nice. It still is a very tasty berry though. You can find it. The other thing that we see on our island, as well as other islands, is what's known as a pollinator shift. So things that are pollinated on mainland populations by small insects get to Hawaii and find that their pollinator is not present here. They still need a way to shuffle their pollen back and forth, so they evolve flowers that will attract pollinators that actually are here locally that they can use to their advantage. So this example here is a plant that was pollinated by a very small insect, and it evolved in Hawaii to be pollinated by a bird with a long curved beak. And the birds evolved basically to get food sources from the plant, and vice versa. Some have evolved the other way. So some got here and tended to be pollinated by birds. Their pollinators weren't present on Hawaii, so instead they evolved in order to be pollinated by insects. Some lost their pollinators altogether and instead became selfing plants or wind pollinated. And this is something that we see a lot of, these pollinator shifts. And it makes sense. If you're on an island with only a handful of insect species, a handful of bird species, you can't be a specialist pollinated plant. You really have to generalize and evolve and sort of roll with it. So, one thing that gets a lot of traction in Hawaii, when we talk about Hawaiian evolution, island evolution, is the idea of a radiation. Right? You guys have all heard about our spectacular adaptive radiations here in Hawaii. If you're a bird person, you've heard the bird adaptive radiations. If you're a plant person, you've heard about those too. A radiation is just an example of a real spectacular diversification in terms of species. So maybe one ancestor arrives here, it quickly speciates and becomes 10, 20, 100, 500 different species, right? We saw a talk last week where Gordon Bennett talked about Drosophila, which was a single arrival and became over 1,000 species, right? That's a spectacular radiation. And I show this picture of a wheel because this helps me remember what a radiation really is. You figure there's a single arrival in the middle, a single spoke, which is of one species that arrives, and then it turns into a number of species, these spokes that radiate out from the center. This is an example of a radiation, or a way to explain what a radiation looks like. You very rarely hear people talk about radiations without talking about adaptation, right? So the textbook story is that something gets here, there's open niches, maybe there's a gap in the canopy so that things can grow tall and take advantage of that light. Maybe there's some wet areas and there's not very many bog plants, so a plant will evolve to adapt to a bog habitat. These are all adaptive speciation events. But not all radiations involve adaptation. There's a lot of other mechanisms that can lead to speciation as well. And we have some of those examples on our islands as well. And we'll talk about some of those right now. So Wallace, in his book, says that a very interesting feature of the sandwich group is the extent to which the species and even the genera are confined to separate islands, right? Now, when Dr. Bennett was talking about his insect group, he said not only are the insects that he studies confined to separate islands, but they're confined to separate volcanoes on those islands. So there's a Haleakala species and a West Maui species. And you can even go farther than that, especially when you talk about things like Drosophila, where each valley, and often each side of a valley, and sometimes even every ridge and peak possesses its peculiar species. And in this example, Wallace is talking about land snails. Snails don't travel very far or very fast. They're sort of famous for being slow, right? So maybe they get from this valley to this valley once every 5 million years. Well, this valley isn't that old. Every 3 million years, there's no gene flow between these valleys because snails move really slow. So each one sort of has a change in allele frequency over time, leading to a differentiation at the species level. This is an example of speciation that's not adaptive. It's not because the weather in this valley is different from the weather in this valley. It's just reproductive isolation. There's just random genetic drift that's facilitated by allopatry, by being in different places. So allopatric speciation can lead to irradiation that has nothing to do with adaptation. It's just a physical separation of species that over time in genetic drift leads to novel species arising. We see this in different valleys, and we see this a lot on different islands, because jumping from one island to the next is even harder than jumping from one valley to the next, especially if you're a snail. Some species don't even need allopatry, so don't even need physical separation to speciate in the absence of adaptation. Plants do this all the time with using a mechanism known as polyploidy. So n equals 20 is the number of chromosomes that this species possesses. How many chromosomes do humans have? 23. We have 46. We have 2 copies of them. Right? So we have an n of 23. Or an n of 46. One of the two. I forget. But what you can happen is you can have a duplication of your chromosomes just caused by a breakdown in the meiotic process. So when you reproduce, all of a sudden you produce an extra set of chromosomes, and you can't then mate with your relative that has half the number of chromosomes that you had. So all of a sudden you find yourself with twice the number of chromosomes. You're a brand new species, and that can happen in a single generation. And this is something that's happened again and again via the process of polyploidy, where plants will just spontaneously duplicate the number of chromosomes in their genome and become a new species. And you guys have seen this all the time if you've eaten strawberries. So if you go pick a wild strawberry, you know they're about that big. They taste very sweet. They're delicious. You go to the grocery store and buy a strawberry, they're like huge, right? And they have all sorts of ridges, and they look like monsters. And that's because they are monsters, because those have about 16 times the number of chromosomes as a wild strawberry. So breeders have taken advantage of this process of polyploidy to make bigger strawberries that are way more, so that they can sell for more. Okay, on islands, this has a pretty big impact on our flora, especially when we talk about biotic disharmony, and this can happen at the species level or at the population level via founder effect. So we have a nice cartoon here. This is a mainland population of red and yellow bugs in more or less equal proportion. So this is our mainland biota. A big windstorm comes, or somebody's playing kick the bug or something. For some reason, this red bug gets launched up into the air, lands on this lily pad, and founds a new group of bugs on this island where before there was no other bugs. Just sort of due to random chance, the fact that a red bug got over there and a yellow bug didn't, your island population all of a sudden only has red bugs. It's not because red bugs are better adapted to this lily pad than yellow bugs. It's just a random chance and a founder effect that was the gene pool that made it over there. So this island then is in biotic disharmony with this mainland source. Is that an adaptive shift? No, it has nothing to do with adaptation. It's just a causal effect. Okay. Then we also have something that's known as genetic drift. This is random change in a population over time due to chance, right? In this example, again with bugs, we have a nice mixed population of green and brown bugs. We have some perturbation in our system. In this case, it's a gentleman's patent leather shoes that stepped on some of the green bugs. It's sort of random. He wasn't aiming for green bugs. They weren't more visible. They didn't make a more interesting squishy sound. They just happened to be stepping on green bugs. And what happened then is you end up with this population that has way more genetic representation of brown bugs than of green bugs. Over time, you might imagine that this entire population will become some shade of brown, and you'll lose a lot of that genetic signature of green bugs, right? This is just random. It's not driven by any adaptation, and it can lead to changes in populations over time, which can lead to changes in species over time. Okay, so we've talked about all the things that are not adaptive radiations, right? Why don't we talk about the things that are adaptive radiations? Because this is one of the things that makes Hawaii such a neat place to study evolution. Adaptive radiations are rapid. So one of the definitions is that it has to happen pretty quickly. Diversification of species that occupy different species. And it involves an adaptive shift as species take on novel ecological roles. So the reason that islands are such wonderful places for these adaptive shifts is that they start off as sterile, uncolonized environments. So pretty much every niche is available to be filled by something. And it's just a question of who gets there first. So adaptive radiation does not require physical separations of population. So we talked about allopatric speciation before with the example of our snails that evolved just because they were physically separated. The thing about adaptive radiation is that they can evolve in sympatry. So you can have species that evolve in the same location at the same time. And what's separating them is not location, but their adaptation to utilize a certain resource or a certain niche that's available in that environment. So here we have an example, again with bugs. We have these two populations of bugs. There's maybe a dry site over here and a wet site over here. You can imagine this is a field somewhere. Some of these bugs adapt more readily to this dry site, and some of these bugs adapt more readily to this wet site. And over time, they get so adapted to their niche that they don't even mate with each other anymore. There's some sort of barrier to reproduction and become separate species. Even though they're located in the exact same spot at the same time, they don't choose to associate with each other. And people can do this experimentally with fruit flies in as few as 3 generations. You rear fruit flies on a high sugar source and a low sugar source. After 3 generations, you can put them back together in the same chamber and they won't mate with each other. So it can happen really, really quickly. And it does. And this was what Darwin realized by observing birds in the Galapagos Islands. Is that by just observing the shape of birds' beaks, he put 2 and 2 together and realized that birds had adapted to their different environments to be able to utilize different resources. So this is one example. We talk about observation and natural history being important. This was so important that this was what led to the theory of evolution, which turns out is pretty important for science. So Darwin's big realization was that these are all very closely related birds. These are finches in the Galapagos Island. They look pretty much the same except for their beaks, which have much different sizes and much different shapes, and it turns out do much different things, right? So on different islands where there's fruit, you have a tree finch that can actually access that fruit, and it has this bill that is able to rip into fruit and get at the pulp inside. On islands where there's more seeds available, you have these bills that have evolved to be able to to crush seeds, and these are birds that live on the ground where seeds tend to fall. Again, you have cactus eaters, you have specialized insect eaters that have bills that can actually go and find these tiny little cracks and pick out bugs. So on different islands where there's different habitats and different niches to fill, these beaks have evolved to be able to fill those different niches, right? So that's the Galapagos. Hawaii's examples are way better than the Galapagos. And the only reason that we study the Galapagos finches in our textbooks is because Darwin got there first. But it should have been Wallace, and it should be us. And the Hawaiian examples should be the ones in the textbook, because look at these beaks of our Hawaiian honey creepers. So this is, again, a single colonist, a single bird, got here to Hawaii. There were very, very few land birds that had flown all the way over here because we're in the middle of the Pacific. Saw lots of opportunities and decided to become an adaptive radiation and fill all of these different niches by developing and evolving all of these different bill shapes. And this is just an illustration of some of the different roles that our honey creepers historically played in Hawaii. Unfortunately, a lot of these have gone extinct. And of course, as they've gone extinct, the plants that they pollinated go extinct along with them because they no longer have pollinators to fill that role. This is a great example of a bird that's pollinating one of our lobelia plants. So this is a spectacular adaptive radiation of plants that co-evolved along with these honey creepers. As honey creepers evolved longer and longer bills to reach deeper into these flowers and get out the nectar, the flowers evolved longer and longer corolla tubes to hide that nectar and to make sure that it was actually their specialist pollinator that would get at that nectar. So we have birds that evolved to feed on flowers. We have birds with short bills that evolved to feed on the ohia flowers. There's a whole bunch of different roles that these honey creepers play in our Hawaiian forests. These have really fallen victim to avian malaria, especially. So a lot of the low elevation birds have been killed off by mosquitoes. And unfortunately, the plants that they pollinated in low elevation are lacking pollinators, and so a lot of those plants have fallen soon. But this is one of our textbook adaptive radiations. So we have another textbook example of adaptive radiation, which I think is really neat, that doesn't involve speciation. What you're looking at here are just different pictures of ohia plants. This is all the same species. They form huge tree trunks like this. This is in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. Big tree trunks like this. We found one, I think it took 5 people hand in hand to go around the trunk of that tree. You see a lot of them. Some of them are growing on campus that are like little shrubs. Sometimes they're even sort of viney. You have red morphs, you have yellow morphs, there's even like a pink morph in Hawaii. So the species name is Metrosideros polymorpha. Poly means many, morpha means shapes. This is a single species that makes many, many different shapes. And I actually brought some examples to pass around. Of what these plants look like.
Is that ohia?
This is ohia. So you notice these are pretty smooth. The leaves are pretty smooth, but some of the leaves you can find are actually really hairy. They're sort of furry leaves. Everything about these can change. The ones that grow near the volcano, near Kilauea, actually reduce the number of stomata to deal with the fog. And what's fascinating about these plants is that these represent probably the greatest elevational gradient that any plant on Earth can tolerate. These grow from sea level, so you can find them really close to the beach if you have a native forest, all the way up to about 9,000 feet. So at the very, very upper limit of tree level where trees can still survive. And all along this gradient, in all of these different shapes and colors and forms of the ohia tree, is all the exact same species. So you can take a tree from 9,000 feet and it will mate quite readily with a tree from sea level. It's amazing how this plant has adapted to our Hawaiian environments and filled so many different niches. But what's incredible is that it hasn't formed different species. that reproductive isolation hasn't happened. And this is one a very rare example of an adaptive radiation that's happened without speciation. Yeah.
Is this the same tree that's getting attacked by that fungus?
Yeah, so this is rapidohea death on Big Island. It has been making a lot of news. There's a fungus that's killing off a lot of these trees really rapidly, hence the name. And we're sort of zeroing in on a vector. And actually your speaker last week, Dr. Bennett, is one of the people who thinks that he's found a beetle that's boring into the trunks of these trees and spreading a fungus that's attacking them. That seems to be the case, although we don't have all of that evidence yet. But right now it's isolated to Big Island. But that would be a big deal, right? Because it's all, this is what's dominating our forests. It's all a single species, and so it could all go down really quickly if it fell victim to a pathogen. Okay, so this is an example of adaptive radiation without species. But what Hawaii is famous for are these adaptive radiations that follow in speciation of this. And probably the most famous example that we have here in Hawaii is the Silver Sword Alliance. And we call it the Alliance because it's not just a single genus, it's 3 different genera that have evolved from a single ancestor that came to Hawaii a number of years ago. So the Silver Sword, Argyroxiphium, Wilksia, which is just on Hawaii. This one is mainly on Maui and then also on Big Island. And then Dubautia, which is spread across all of the main Hawaiian islands. We have species. I'm going to show you a number of these species in this group, but I want you to bear in mind is that this is the likely ancestor. A simple tarweed, or again, a dandelion that grows in California. This thing is really small. It's totally unremarkable. You would probably trample it without ever thinking about it if you were in California. There's nothing great about this thing, other than the fact that somehow these seeds were able to travel from North America over to Hawaii, probably about 6 million years ago, and radiate all across our islands. Yes?
So I'm guessing in California, they're probably considered, I'm guessing this is considered one of those pests that people spray with weed killer or something?
Well, it's not quite a pest, but it's not uncommon. It's not hard to find. So one thing about the silver sword is that it got here and then it very, very quickly radiated to cover pretty much every empty niche in Hawaii. What you're looking at here is just an elevation gradient. So this is 100 meters. So this is 4,000 meters. This is the very, very top of Haleakala and probably Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea is about right there. This is sea level. Each one of these letter combinations is one species from the Silver Sword Alliance, right? And these bars represent the elevational span of one of these species. So this species, Dubautia, I don't know what species it is, covers everything from about 1,000 meters up to about 3,500 meters. So that's a pretty good span. Most species are much more limited, right? So this is only grows very limited, maybe 100 meter span or so. But when you look at all of these in aggregate and line them all up, you see that one of these species from this group, from the single ancestor, pretty much covers every inch of elevation in Hawaii, from sea level to the very, very top of the highest volcano. This one ancestor, one of the species that's developed from it, is covering some part of our volcanoes. Yeah.
So for any of these species, is there like one where you could buy like as a garden plant for your yard or something?
Can you buy any of these for your garden? I don't think any of these are really used in landscaping.
The green sword, the Hawaii green sword, they sell it at Home Depot sometimes.
Really?
Wilksia, yeah.
Huh. I've never seen that in anybody's yard, but I'd grow it. You need a pretty wet yard. The same thing here, this is a similar figure. Instead of elevation on the x-axis here, we have mean annual rainfall. This is 100 centimeters. So this is, you know, part of the wettest part of our island. So this is Mount Ka'ala or Kauai, the Alakai Swamp that gets a lot of rain. And these are some of the drier parts of our islands, you know, the leeward forests. And again, you can see that the Silver Sword Alliance has the driest sites covered and the wettest sites covered, all from a single progenitor species, or a single colonist that covered all these different plants. So I'm just going to run through what these plants look like, just to give you a sense of how a single species can radiate out into so many different forms. Our Gyroxiphium, this is our silver sword that grows in the top of Haleakala. It's really famous. It's about 5 species. All of them are on Maui. They're outplanting some to Big Island. And this is what it looks like. At the very, very top of the volcano, they have these nice silvery leaves that are adapted to high UV radiation, so they can withstand really hot sun, a lot of UV radiation. They all have this is the green sword that your classmate was talking about, that I guess you can buy at Home Depot every once in a while. It's a pretty plant. Most of these have sort of this basal rosette, and then it'll throw up a spray of flowers, a big shoot of flowers with the stem of flower. And this is the part that withstands, that sort of survives from year to year. The Ka'u green sword, this is on West Maui. Again, same type of form you can see with the basal leaves and then a big flower sprout. I'm not sure who she is. The flowers still look like, they have these big spray of flowers, but the flowers still sort of look like dandelions, right? So it maintains that form. And this is the Ka'u silver sword as well. This is the real famous silver sword that grows at the very tippy top of Haleakala. This is the biggest one, and probably the one that's most in danger. It's really spectacular. How many people have actually seen this flowering up at Haleakala? It's pretty. The Hawaiian name Ahina Hina just means sort of shiny, silvery. Okay. Wilksia, this is the genus that's only found on Hawaii. This is only 2 species, and look how different these are. So it's sort of a variation on a form, right? So it has that same funky leaf shape with really sharp, long leaves at the base of the plant, but then it forms these super tall flower stalks that are several meters high. And these are only found in a really small area near the state park in Waimea. And this one is really critically endangered, and this is much smaller. It's the dwarf. So this plant's only about that big, and the flower stalk's only about that big. Okay, Dubautia is the genus that's probably the most widespread and has the most number of examples. This is found on all of our main Hawaiian islands, and I'm just going to flip through these really quickly just to show you what type of variation you find. So it forms these trees. Again, it looks nothing like those silver swords, right, until you start looking at the flower. You see, well, the flower looks familiar, even though it just doesn't bear any resemblance to that silver sword, really. You find shrubs in some of these dry areas. This is another tree form, Muxenii. This is latifolia, which is a vine. So he's holding the latifolia right there. Sort of weird. Forms that vine shape. Benzizii, find it very, very high elevation. This is a really small thing, so it has maybe a familiar shape of those leaves, as those long, pointy leaves, but they're tiny. They're only about that big. Yeah?
Are any of these silver sword species planted on the campus somewhere?
I do not believe so, but we can check the campus plants map and see if we can find any of them. Plantagenea, again, makes sort of dense mats. Reticulata makes big trees. Scabra is a really cool one because it makes these sort of pin-cushion mats on the edge of very high elevation lava flows. That's sort of fun to go see. More of these, the imbricata, again. Waialeale has a real limited distribution, again, makes this interesting sort of pincushion shape, or like beanbag shape. Wainapanapa'ensis is only found in bogs on Maui, in East Maui bogs. So it's adapted to these really wet environments. Okay, so key points for this lecture. We talked about how island evolution is typified by gigantism, loss of defenses and pollinator-ships, and that's on islands all over the world. Allopatric speciation takes place when populations are physically separated, as is the case for our land snails in different valleys, and we see this a lot on different islands as well. That doesn't require some sort of selective adaptation. It can just be random. Our adaptive radiations are rapid diversification of species occupying different niches. And that can be sympatric, so that can happen at the same place at the same time. And we have a couple of great examples of those, including our honey creeper birds and our silver swords, that are ones that are real textbook examples that really illustrate this process of adaptive radiation. So I went through that really quickly. Thanks for hanging on and bearing with me. So that I can talk a little bit about Kaina Point. So we're gonna keep on reminding you about this in the next few lectures. It's 2 Saturdays from now, February 28th. It's optional. We're gonna carpool there. It's a pretty tough but doable hike. You guys all look sturdy enough to make it if you bring enough water. And every year we see something really fun. And I'm going to show you, in lieu of talking about it some more, I'm going to show you a video that was made a couple of years ago, which features a couple of UH biologists who study out there. And they're going to talk not just about the natural history, but about how that's changed over the past decade when they built a predator exposure fence. Yeah.